From a distance, Sandringham looks like a perfect picture. Endless open fields, dense woodland, a Norfolk sky so wide it makes you believe nothing dangerous could ever hide here. In the public imagination, this is one of the most peaceful places in the British royal world. A retreat, a symbol of family life, tradition, and stability. But Sandringham once nearly killed the heir to the throne, not with a weapon, not with a political plot, but with something that seems harmless in every home. Water. Beneath the quiet corridors, behind red brick walls, there exists a system few people ever want to talk about. Pipes, drains, technical passageways patched together across generations, quietly operating beneath royal life. And Sandringham was not the only place at risk. The same kind of danger once haunted Buckingham Palace in the heart of London. It filled a royal residence with the stench of a city slowly rotting up from below, and it exposed weaknesses so severe that a stranger once stood beside the Queen's bed, unnoticed. This is not a story about luxury, and it is not a story about ceremony. This is a story about invisible systems, clean water, bad smells, uniforms, and the corridor's power would rather you never see. From a gift given in 1862 to a son considered too difficult to control, to a break-in at the heart of the palace in 1982, and further still, to a treasure by Leonardo da Vinci hidden for nearly 200 years in the shadows of Windsor. These pieces do not belong to the same story, but they all lead to the same question. What truly holds power in place? Walls of stone several meters thick, or systems no one notices until they begin to fail? If what lies beneath the surface of power makes you curious, press like to help this story reach further. And if you want to keep exploring places that appear untouchable, yet hide the most secrets, subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. Because what is hidden most carefully often shapes power more than anything else. To understand Sandringham, we have to go back to a time before it became a symbol. Back to the year 1862. When a quiet estate in Norfolk was chosen not for rest, but to solve a problem the royal family could not openly discuss. And that is where the story truly begins. Sandringham was born as a strategy of distance. Norfolk in the mid-19th century was not a place people went to touch power. It was a rural region in eastern England, more than 170 kilometers from London. In an era before motorways or high-speed rail, that distance was not just a number. It meant hours of travel by steam train, followed by horse-drawn carriage, a journey long enough to break completely from the political rhythm of the capital. London at the time was the absolute center, where Parliament operated, where mass newspapers were exploding in circulation, where rumor could reach hundreds of thousands of readers overnight. Norfolk was the opposite, sparsely populated, lightly covered by the press, almost entirely outside the pulse of court life. It was precisely this imbalance that made Sandringham different. By the mid-19th century, the British monarchy was no longer absolute. Political power had shifted to Parliament, yet the royal family retained another role that was just as critical: symbolic stability. After revolutions swept across Europe, especially in France, power could no longer be secured through fear or divine authority alone. The British monarchy chose a different path. It rebuilt itself around morality, discipline, and the image of a model family. The reign of Queen Victoria embodied that strategy more clearly than any other. Victoria did not appear only as a queen. She appeared as a devoted wife, a committed mother, a moral symbol in a society undergoing rapid industrialization. That image was not accidental. It was constructed deliberately to project stability to the public. And within that system, the heir to the throne was not permitted to be a free individual. He was the continuation of the symbol. Albert Edward, Victoria's eldest son, entered adulthood inside this contradiction. In title, he was the Prince of Wales. In reality, every action he took was closely scrutinized. Edward did not fit the strict moral framework the Victorian court sought to preserve. He was highly visible in social life. His personal relationships unsettled the inner court, and London's press began to pay attention, not because he broke the law, but because he did not play the role expected of him. In a monarchy that survived on public confidence, the image of the heir was no longer a private matter. It was political capital. That was when Sandringham entered the picture. In 1862, Sandringham was purchased as a private residence for the Prince of Wales. On the surface, it was a gift upon his marriage, a country retreat. But placed against the reality of London at that time, the decision carried a very different meaning. Sandringham was not close to the center of power. It lay outside the direct gaze of the press, outside political salons, outside social circles where scandal could ignite without warning. Geographic distance became a filter. At Sandringham, the heir still existed, but he existed beyond the spotlight, not to disappear, but to be managed. This was not punishment, nor was it neglect. It was a form of private management. At this level, power does not need constant visibility. It needs space to recalibrate, to soften tensions, and to control reputational risk. Sandringham was therefore more than an estate. It was a buffer zone, far enough from London to reduce exposure, yet close enough to remain within the royal orbit. In modern terms, it resembled a large corporation moving a young executive away from headquarters, not to remove him, but to shape him in an environment where risk could be contained. But distance did more than quiet public attention. It created another separation. Between Queen Victoria and the Sun, she could not mold according to her expectations. Within the British monarchy, difference was not resolved through public confrontation. It was handled through space. Rather than open conflict, the institution chose relocation. Less contact, less visibility. Less opportunity for mass newspapers to amplify behavior into crisis. This approach was distinctly British, not eliminating contradiction, but removing it from view. Sandringham did not solve the problem of the heir. It simply ensured the problem no longer appeared in London. Yet this silence planted the seed of a new paradox. Because when an heir is removed from public scrutiny, he is not only protected, he is also granted something else, control over space. And this is where the story begins to turn. From the moment Edward stepped into Sandringham, not merely as someone being managed, but as an owner, a new form of power began to take shape. Not political power, but power over environment. And that power would soon transform Sandringham from an instrument of control into a world rewritten according to the will of the heir himself. Edward rewrites the house. When distance is no longer enough, power begins to restructure space. In 1862, Sandringham was purchased, but for nearly a decade afterward, it remained little more than a royal property on paper. The old Georgian house still stood, balanced, ordered, restrained, an architectural expression of the 18th century discipline, not the psychology of a young heir coming of age in the Victorian era. Then, around 1870, everything changed. Edward did not renovate the house. He erased it. The Georgian structure was demolished entirely. Not because it was failing, but because it no longer served its purpose. At Sandringham, Edward did not want a place to live. He wanted a space that could operate according to his own rhythm, and this is where the story begins to turn. The new house rose in a 16th and 17th century revival style. Not a historically accurate reconstruction, but a carefully selected architectural language designed to create atmosphere. Steep roofs, heavy gables, red brick walls with visual weight, tall windows pulling daylight deep into the interior. If Georgian architecture represented order and restraint, this revival represented personal authority and presence. The house did not attempt to blend into the landscape. It asserted itself as the center. Inside, the structure revealed its intention even more clearly. The space was not organized around ceremony. It was organized around entertainment. The billiard room was built larger than those found in most aristocratic houses of the period. Warm lighting, ceilings low enough to contain sound. This was not a room designed for silence. Reception rooms were not rigidly separated. They flowed into one another. Music, conversation, and the sound of glasses could travel freely through the house without interruption. In certain areas, concealed corners were designed deliberately. Small rooms, low light, doors hidden behind wooden panels. Not for secrecy in the sensational sense, but to create zones that were not under constant observation. In a system where the heir was always watched, privacy itself became a form of soft power. But the house was only the outer shell. What Edward truly restructured was the land. Sandringham ceased to be a rural estate. It became a large-scale hunting ground. More than 20,000 acres were reorganized. Woodlands were planted deliberately to shape hunting routes. Clearings were open for gathering riders and game. Movement paths were calculated to support hunts lasting for hours. By the late 19th century, Sandringham operated one of the most carefully managed shooting estates in Europe. Guests were not only British aristocrats, they included diplomats and princes from other royal courts. This was no longer personal leisure. It was social power structured as entertainment. And then came a detail that changed everything. Sandringham time. Edward ordered every clock on the estate to run 30 minutes ahead of standard time. Not as a joke, not due to technical error. The purpose was explicit, to extend hunting day. But the implication went far beyond sport. In a world where time was being standardized by the state and the railway, for a single individual to impose a private time system across tens of thousands of acres was extraordinary. Edward did not merely own the land. He controlled the rhythm of time within it. This was a power-defining event. Owning space allows control of movement. Owning time allows control of reality. At Sandringham, the day began earlier. Activities followed a private cadence. Guests entering the estate adjusted their watches to the owner's clock. No decree was announced. No declaration was made. The adjustment was automatic. But this still does not fully explain the consequences of Sandringham. Because when an heir is granted control over space, leisure, and time, the estate stops being a tool of management. It becomes a private world. And that world would soon produce a major crisis, one that did not arise from behavior, but from the hidden infrastructure beneath Sandringham's carefully curated surface. And that is where the story moves into far more dangerous territory. Maturity and the rewriting of function. And the cracks begin to form beneath the appearance of calm. By the late 1880s, Sandringham entered a new phase. Not because the architecture changed dramatically, but because the man who lived inside it had changed. Edward was no longer a restless heir testing the boundaries of personal power. He was moving steadily toward the role the court had prepared for him over decades. And once again, Sandringham was required to adapt. Spaces once designed for entertainment began to recede. They did not disappear entirely, but they no longer occupied the center of daily life. Late-night gatherings grew less frequent. Music and games were no longer the default sounds filling the house each evening. Instead, the rhythm slowed. It became more ordered, more ceremonial. A decision emerged during this period that carried deep symbolic weight. The bowling alley, one of the clearest expressions of Sandringham's youthful phase, was dismantled, not to be removed, but to be transformed into a long library. Polished wooden lanes gave way to rows of bookshelves. Lighting was lowered. Sound was absorbed rather than amplified. This library was not a display of power. It was a space for reading, reflection, and extended silence. The transformation was functional, but it was also psychological. Sandringham was no longer a stage for energy. It was becoming a place meant to be lived in over time. The interior of the house shifted accordingly. Colors grew darker, fabrics heavier, curtains thicker, lighting warmer and steadier, suited to family evenings rather than social spectacle. Family rituals became more frequent and more defined. Shared dinners, walks at fixed hours, seasonal routines repeated year after year. Sandringham slowly became a true home, not merely a private domain. But within this stability, a quiet contradiction began to form. Sandringham had never been built all at once. It had been expanded, modified, and repurposed continuously for nearly 2 decades. Plumbing systems were not installed as a unified whole. Drainage lines were added in stages. New pipes often ran alongside older ones without full replacement. Above ground, everything appeared calm. Below the floors, the structure was becoming dangerously complex. This was not a single design failure. It was the consequence of a house changing function faster than its infrastructure could keep up. A place once optimized for entertainment, later reshaped for family life, still relied on systems designed for earlier purposes. And this is where the story begins to slip off its safe trajectory. Because in the 19th century, infrastructure was not the first thing people associated with power. Yet it was infrastructure that determined who remained healthy, who fell ill, and who never left their rooms again. At this moment, Sandringham appeared to embody stability. A quiet countryside retreat, a contained royal household, a predictable rhythm of life. But beneath the thick carpets and solid wooden floors, a risk was building. and no one inside the house could see it with the naked eye. Not a social scandal, not a political crisis, but a silent threat embedded in the very substance required to sustain life. And that was when Sandringham entered the most dangerous phase of its history, the water crisis. When power meets biological limits, in 1871, a crisis unfolded at Sandringham. Not a social scandal, not a political confrontation. Edward fell seriously ill. The symptoms came quickly and violently. Sustained high fever, severe physical weakness. Signs 19th century medicine feared above all else. Physicians soon suspected a disease that had haunted Europe for decades: typhoid fever. To the public, the news was shocking. The heir to the throne struck by an illness commonly associated with poor sanitation and contaminated water. To the royal family, the threat was more fundamental. Not reputation, but survival. Sandringham had been chosen for its clean air and distance from London. Yet now the estate itself was under suspicion. And this is where the story takes a dangerous turn. A technical investigation was launched. Not publicly, not ceremonially. Engineers and physicians examined the entire system of drains, wells, and underground pipes across the estate. They did not look at facades. They looked beneath the floors. What they found was not a single failure. It was a patchwork. Wells positioned too close to waste outlets. Old pipes running parallel to newer ones. Points where clean water and wastewater crossed without adequate separation. Sandringham had expanded faster than its sanitation could adapt. In a house whose function had changed repeatedly, infrastructure had fallen behind. The conclusion was unavoidable. The water supply had been contaminated. This explained Edward's illness. But it raised a far more unsettling question. If the heir to the throne could be endangered by the drinking water inside his own residence, how fragile was power really? This is where the value framework emerges. When power is directly threatened, it does not debate, it does not delay. It buys engineering. In the mid-1870s, a project without precedent at Sandringham began: the Appleton Water Tower. Around 1877, a massive water tower was constructed at the highest point of the estate, nearly 18 meters tall. Designed with Byzantine-inspired elements, not for display, but for durability. Inside stood an enormous iron tank, large enough to supply clean water to the entire house for extended periods. Water was no longer drawn from older wells. It was sourced from a newly drilled supply, deeply bored and fully isolated from waste systems. The height of the tower created natural pressure. Water flowed evenly to every room. No constant pumping, no stagnation. This was not merely a sanitary upgrade. It was a biological defense system. The tower served another purpose as well. In the event of fire, it could supply multiple hydrants simultaneously, a level of protection rare among estates of the period. Inside Sandringham, renovations continued. The plumbing system was replaced in stages. Old pipes were removed. New lines were installed with strict separation between clean water and waste. Sanitary spaces were modernized. Drainage was ventilated more effectively. Odors were expelled outward rather than circulating back into living areas. These changes were not aesthetic. They were existential. Sandringham was no longer just a beautiful place to live. It became a system capable of protecting those inside it. And here a powerful image takes shape. The crown meets plumbing, not in ceremony, but underground. At its deepest level, power does not survive on image or ritual. It survives through the ability to purchase the right technology at the right moment. But the story does not end here, because if Sandringham, with its open land and clean air, could become a biological threat, then a far larger question remained. Older palaces, more crowded, more complex, were they truly safe? And that question would soon pull the story away from Sandringham and into the very heart of London, where smell, water, and power collided with far greater force. Buckingham Palace and the Great Stink. When the center of power could not escape the smell of its own foundations. By the mid-19th century, London was expanding faster than any other European city. Its population surged from roughly 2 million to over 3 million within a few decades. Housing spread outward at speed. But infrastructure did not. Much of London's sewer system still relied on medieval designs. Large areas discharged waste directly into the River Thames. No filtration, no treatment. At the same time, flush toilets were becoming widespread. Wastewater volumes increased dramatically, yet the sewers remained unchanged. The result was a city operating on a system already pushed beyond its limits. In the summer of 1858, the system collapsed. Temperatures rose unusually high. The water level of the Thames dropped. Waste accumulated, no longer carried away by the current. The smell began to rise, not a passing odor, but a dense, clinging stench that seeped into every inhabited space. The public named it the Great Stink, a city-wide assault on the senses. Buildings along the river hung curtains soaked in chlorine and lime in an attempt to block the odor. It did not work. At the Palace of Westminster, where Parliament met, sessions were disrupted. Documents were treated with chemicals. Windows were sealed shut in the heat of summer. The smell did more than offend, it paralyzed government. And this is where the story reaches the most symbolic center of power in Britain: Buckingham Palace. In appearance, the palace represented royal permanence. Vast rooms, thick walls, surfaces trimmed in gold. But Buckingham Palace was not isolated from London's infrastructure. Its drainage systems were connected to the city network. And when that network failed, the palace suffered as well. Odors crept into corridors. Leaks appeared in parts of the drainage system. Daily life inside the residence was directly affected. There are no widely published official images, but contemporary records indicate that the palace was not spared. And here a stark contradiction emerged. A palace may be gilded in gold, but it cannot overpower the smell of an empire rotting from its foundations. The Great Stink was not merely a sanitation crisis. It was a political turning point. Parliament was forced to act, not out of reformist idealism, but because governance itself became physically impossible. Millions of pounds were approved to construct a modern sewer system for London, one of the largest infrastructure projects of the 19th century. This was a rare moment when power was forced to look downward, not by public pressure alone, but because the consequences of neglect had entered the halls of authority. Yet this still does not answer the deeper question. If both Parliament and Buckingham Palace could be overwhelmed by the same failing system, then where exactly did the boundary between power and vulnerability lie? And this is where the story prepares to turn once again, away from smells in the air and toward intrusions far more personal, far more alarming, into the most private spaces of the monarchy itself. But this is where the story turns. Thomas Crapper and the Sanitation Revolution. When power shifted from concealment to standardization after the Great Stink, the royal household and the government had no real choice. The problem was no longer the smell. It was the structure. Temporary measures, chemicals, curtains, sealed windows, all failed. What needed to change lay deeper, beneath the floors, inside the pipes that power had long learned to ignore. It was in this moment that one name began appearing consistently in royal technical records: Thomas Crapper. He did not invent the flush toilet. Early versions had existed since the 16th century, but Crapper standardized it. Born in 1836 in Yorkshire, he entered the sanitation trade at precisely the moment London was confronting the consequences of uncontrolled growth. Rather than focusing on appearance, he focused on systems. The core problem was not the toilet itself. It was what happened after the water was flushed. Crapper refined the trap, the S-shaped water seal, a curved section that retained water, forming a natural barrier that prevented sewer gases from rising back into living spaces. He improved airflow ventilation within the pipe network. Waste gases were directed outward in a controlled path, instead of accumulating and forcing their way through cracks and joints inside buildings. Most critically, he addressed backflow, the reverse movement of waste and gases when the system pressure changed. These innovations were not glamorous. They were invisible, but they transformed life inside large buildings. When Crapper's systems were installed at Sandringham and other royal properties, the effects were immediate. Odors diminished, disease risk declined, and the burden on household staff was significantly reduced. Staff no longer avoided certain corridors. Entire wings were no longer quietly closed off due to smell. Emergency repairs ceased to be a silent daily ritual, yet the deeper impact lay at the level of power. Previously, the monarchy responded to crises through concealment, relocation, isolation, image control. Now it chose a different path: standardization, applying the same technical principles across entire systems. No exemptions for rank, no compromises for ritual. This was a power-defining event. Power shifted from hiding problems to controlling them through engineering. Not through symbols, but through standards. And yet even this sanitation revolution did not end the story. Because once the pipes were under control, another kind of vulnerability began to surface. No smell, no bacteria, no warning signs, only corridors, passageways, and people who had been inside all along. But this is where the story turns. Security. When security becomes the new battlefield of power, to understand why security became a matter of survival for the British monarchy, we must return to its oldest defensive symbol, Windsor Castle. Windsor was never conceived as a ceremonial palace. It was built as a military fortress. Construction began around 1070, under William the Conqueror. The site sits on elevated ground overlooking the River Thames, approximately 35 kilometers west of London. This location was not chosen for beauty. It was chosen for strategy. From this position, royal forces could control western approaches to London. Incoming armies could be detected from miles away, and if necessary, the monarch could retreat and hold ground. For nearly 1,000 years, Windsor has remained the largest occupied castle in the world. The estate covers more than 5 hectares. Its stone walls measure several meters thick. Dozens of towers, narrow gates, and deliberately curved entrances were designed to slow any attacker. Inside, architecture served control rather than comfort. Corridors were narrow to restrict movement. Spiral staircases forced intruders to slow down and lose orientation. Hidden passages allowed the king to escape if outer defenses failed. Throughout the medieval and early modern periods, this was an exceptionally effective defensive machine. But the nature of threat changed. By the 19th century, the British monarchy no longer faced armies marching toward castle gates. There were no sieges, no ladders against the walls, no cannons battering stone. The new danger did not come from outside. It came from within. Infiltration. No banners, no weapons, no forced entry. Only the right corridor, the correct uniform, in the absence of suspicion. This is the paradox of historic palaces. The secret passageways that once saved kings in wartime became blind spots in modern security. Servants' staircases, service corridors, seldom used rooms. Together they formed a parallel circulation system, one that ran beside ceremonial spaces but was not always closely monitored. Windsor contains hundreds of rooms, dozens of internal routes, multiple layers where private life and operational movement overlap. The structure was designed to protect power from armies. But in the modern world, it began to expose power to a different kind of risk. Security was no longer a matter of stone and steel. It became a matter of people, routines, and assumptions. Who is allowed to pass? Who is assumed to belong? And who is never questioned? But this is where the story turns. Because if even a fortress built for war like Windsor was no longer immune to modern infiltration, then what was happening inside palaces never meant to defend themselves at all. Palaces built for ceremony, for openness, for daily access. And soon after, one event at Buckingham Palace would expose this vulnerability in a way no one expected. 1982. When a man walked into the Queen's bedroom, 1982, Buckingham Palace, the modern center of royal power in Britain, not a fortress, no deep moats, no stone walls meters thick like Windsor. Buckingham Palace was built for ceremony, reception, and public presence. Every day, hundreds of staff moved in and out, dozens of entrances, hundreds of windows. In the early hours of July 9, 1982, a man named Michael Fagan approached the eastern fence of the palace. Fagan was not a soldier, not a spy. He carried no weapon. He climbed a fence roughly 4 meters high, dropped into the inner grounds, and moved toward the exterior wall of the building. A ground floor window was not fully secured. Fagan climbed inside. The alarm system was triggered, but inside the control room, the signal was dismissed as a false alarm. It was not the first malfunction, not the first false alert, and no immediate response followed. This was where the chain of failure began. Inside the palace, Fagan entered a maze. Long corridors covered in thick carpet, low lighting, sound completely absorbed. Buckingham Palace is not a single coherent structure. It is an accumulation of wings layered across centuries. Ceremonial corridors, staff passageways, service staircases, rooms rarely used. Fagan moved deeper. He passed display rooms. walked beneath portraits, went through doors where no one stopped to ask who he was. A cleaner saw him, but assumed he belonged there. No uniform was required. Confidence was enough. Approximately 15 minutes passed. No one intervened. Fagan reached the private area. A door separating ceremonial space from the Queen's personal quarters was unattended at that moment. The door opened. Inside was the bedroom of Queen Elizabeth II. She was alone. Fagan stood beside the bed, pulled back the curtains. Morning light flooded the room. A conversation followed, lasting several minutes. The Queen remained calm. She spoke to keep him engaged, quietly attempting to trigger an emergency alarm. The alarm did not bring an immediate response. Eventually, a member of staff entered the room, recognized the situation, and summoned security. Fagan was restrained. There was no serious violence, no weapon. But the shock reverberated throughout the entire system. What made this incident extraordinary was not only that Fagan reached the Queen's bedroom, but why he came. According to his later statements, Michael Fagan said he wanted to speak with the Queen. At the time, Britain was in the grip of a severe economic crisis. Unemployment had exceeded 3 million, the highest level since the Second World War. Fagan was unemployed, recently divorced, struggling with personal collapse and a sense of social exclusion. According to police records and later interviews, he believed the Queen was the only person who might listen, not because of executive power, but because she symbolized the nation outside party politics. Some details of his account are inconsistent, and historians remain cautious about verifying every aspect of the exchange. But one fact is clear. This was not an act of violent conspiracy. It was an illusion of access. Fagan did not see Buckingham Palace as a fortress. He saw it as a place he could walk into to be heard, and that is what made the incident so dangerous. The subsequent investigation showed this was not a failure of a single individual. It was a sequence of small failures: a fence that could be climbed, a window that could be entered, an alarm that was ignored, staff accustomed to false alerts, private areas left briefly unattended. No single mistake was catastrophic on its own. Together they were. What protected the monarchy was never just walls or gates. It was operational discipline. When discipline erodes into routine, when assumption replaces verification, an ordinary person can reach the heart of power. And yet this was still not the end of the story. The Fagan incident, as shocking as it was, remained an intrusion from the outside. A few years later, another threat emerged. No fence climbed, no window forced. That individual walked through the front gate, wore a uniform, and was paid to be inside. But this is where the story turns. Undercover footman. When a uniform opens every door after the Michael Fagan incident in 1982, Buckingham Palace reinforced fences, windows, and alarm systems. But security does not exist only at the gates. It exists in hiring. In the early 2000s, a British journalist named Ryan Perry chose a different path. No fences climbed, no windows forced, no night intrusion. He applied for a job, a footman position, entry-level household staff, operational, not ceremonial. No public exposure. The recruitment process moved faster than many would expect. Background checks were minimal. A brief reference call. No deep scrutiny of motivation or previous profession. And Perry was hired. The moment he put on the royal uniform, everything changed. The uniform was not just clothing, it was a signal. Inside Buckingham Palace, a uniform meant belonging. No one asked many questions. No one demanded explanations. No one stopped him to verify access. The uniform became a kind of passport. Perry moved freely through spaces the public never sees. Staff corridors running behind ceremonial rooms. Service staircases connecting floors like arteries. Storage areas holding thousands of items. From silver trays to table linens. He entered purely operational spaces. Rooms never designed for cameras, and he began documenting, not luxury, but routine. Cereal boxes stacked in kitchens, crowded storage rooms, empty corridors staff walked through every day. He took photographs. No one stopped him. Not because he was discreet, but because no one imagined a uniformed staff member needed to be questioned. Perry even stepped onto the palace balcony. the iconic platform where the royal family appears during national events. Up close, the balcony was modest, far less grand than it appears on television. But standing there mattered. An outsider, not royal, not powerful, standing where millions only ever watch from afar. When the photographs were published, the public was not shocked by extravagance. They were shocked by ordinariness. Buckingham Palace appeared as a vast organization functioning day by day, with warehouses, technical corridors, repetitive routines. And there, another vulnerability was exposed. Not architectural, not technological. A vulnerability of trust. No one questioned why a new employee was present in so many areas. No one asked why he was taking photographs. Because in this system, the uniform had already done the work of the walls. Uniform beats walls. Not because the walls were weak, but because people trusted symbols more than procedures. After the incident, Buckingham Palace was forced to reassess its internal operations. Not only who could enter, but who was trusted. Yet even that did not close the story, because what Perry revealed was not only a security flaw, it was another truth. Behind ceremony, symbolism, and power, royal palaces remain places where people live and work every day. And wherever people exist, habits follow. But this is where the story turns. From security, the narrative now shifts toward what is kept most hidden inside these walls. Not people, not corridors, but what is stored away. Leonardo da Vinci, the mind power, chose to protect inside Britain's royal palaces. The most carefully guarded thing is not gold, not crowns, and not private rooms. It is knowledge. And the name at the center of that treasure is Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo was not merely a painter. If he had been, his work would not have been kept hidden for centuries. Born in 1452, Leonardo lived in a world without modern science, without engines, without experimental medicine. Yet on his pages, ideas appeared that humanity would not fully understand for hundreds of years. He dissected the human body when doing so was forbidden. He drew muscles, bones, and veins with an accuracy medicine would only confirm in the 19th century. He studied the movement of water not as an artist, but as a physicist. The vortices he sketched would later become the foundation of fluid dynamics. He designed flying machines before humans understood the principles of flight. He sketched armored vehicles, rotating bridges, gears long before the industrial age existed. But what truly set Leonardo apart was not any single invention. It was how he thought. For Leonardo, drawing was not decoration. Drawing was thinking. His sketches were not finished artworks. They were a mind in motion, captured on paper. And because of that, they were never meant for display. Today, more than 600 drawings by Leonardo are preserved at Windsor Castle. No harsh light, no permanent exhibition, no unrestricted access. Many of these sheets appear almost blank to the naked eye. Leonardo used extremely fine metal point. The lines faded until they were nearly invisible. Only with the arrival of ultraviolet light did what time had hidden begin to emerge. Under UV illumination, the lines returned. Not just images, but the entire process of thought, corrections, abandoned ideas, unfinished mechanisms. Some pages once dismissed as empty were revealed to contain the full structure of a machine. Leonardo did not draw to publish. He drew to understand, and that is why his knowledge had to be protected like something alive and fragile. To preserve Leonardo was not to preserve a famous artist. It was to preserve a way of thinking through war, through fire, and through the collapse of empires. And here a paradox appears. If the monarchy could protect those fragile sheets of paper for more than 5 centuries, why were there other places built of stone and authority that nearly disappeared? But this is where the story turns. From the most carefully guarded intellect, the narrative returns to Sandringham, a place that did not protect knowledge, but people. Whitehall, where power learned how to fall, 17th century. London. Before Buckingham Palace became the central symbol, the power of England was concentrated at the Palace of Whitehall. Whitehall was not merely a palace. It was the largest palace in Europe at the time. More than 1,500 rooms, stretching nearly 800 meters along the River Thames, home to the Tudor and Stuart monarchs, the center of administration, ceremony, and absolute royal authority. Within this vast complex stood a structure of singular symbolic weight, the banqueting house. In 1619, its ceiling was commissioned to the master painter Peter Paul Rubens, not for decoration, but for declaration. The painting celebrated the divine right of kings, the belief that royal authority came directly from God. The king ruled not by consent of the people, but by divine will. Anyone entering the hall was forced to look upward, not just at art, but at power made sacred. The man who walked beneath that ceiling most often was Charles I. Charles I was King of England, Scotland, and Ireland, reigning from 1625. He lived more than 3 centuries before Elizabeth II, in an England that was not yet a constitutional monarchy, where the king believed his authority stood above Parliament. Charles I believed absolutely in divine right. He viewed Parliament as an instrument, not a counterbalance. But England was changing. Trade expanded. A middle class emerged. Parliament demanded control over taxation and spending. The conflict was no longer ideological. It became a struggle for power. In 1642, the English Civil War erupted. The nation fractured. Royalist forces turned their weapons against the armies of Parliament. For the first time in modern European history, a reigning monarch was captured and put on trial by his own subjects. Charles I was charged with treason, not against a foreign enemy, but against the nation he ruled. January 30th, 1649. A bitter winter morning. Outside the banqueting house, a wooden execution platform was erected against the wall. Not in a public square, but within the very space of former royal power. Charles I stepped outside. He passed through the banqueting house one final time, walked beneath Rubens's ceiling, where divine authority had been painted as unquestionable. Then he stepped onto the frozen ground beyond. Only a few steps separated a king praised as chosen by God from a man stripped entirely of that authority. Charles I was executed. The moment did not merely end a reign, it shattered a doctrine, yet Whitehall remained until 1698. One winter night, a fire broke out in a secondary residential area of the palace. Contemporary accounts suggest the cause was an overheated fireplace, left unattended while much of the palace was unoccupied. The flames spread rapidly through the aging timber structures. Fire prevention systems were virtually non-existent. Within hours, most of the Palace of Whitehall was destroyed. More than 1,000 rooms vanished. Administrative offices, ceremonial halls, the physical center of royal authority in England. Only the banqueting house survived. After the fire, the monarchy chose not to rebuild Whitehall. This was not a technical decision. It was a political one. Whitehall was inseparable from absolute divine monarchy, from a king who had been executed, from a model of power that no longer fit the nation. Instead of rebuilding, the royal court shifted to other residences, smaller, more adaptable, less absolute. The banqueting house still stands today. Rubens' ceiling still glorifies royal power, but the authority it once sanctified no longer exists in the same form. And here, history leaves a stark message. Spaces can outlast power. But power is never guaranteed by the spaces built to contain it. But this is where the story turns. Because after divine right collapsed, the British monarchy had to learn something else. How to survive without absolute power. The pandemic and HMS bubble, when power faced an invisible enemy, the year 2020. The United Kingdom. After centuries of confronting war, infiltration, political collapse, and ideological breakdown, the British monarchy faced a threat unlike any before. No armies, no intruders, no violence, only something invisible. A virus. The COVID-19 pandemic spread across Europe at a speed unseen in modern history. Everything that had once protected the monarchy, stone walls, iron gates, ceremony, armed security, proved meaningless against the risk of infection. The figure needing protection was no longer just an individual. It was the symbol of national continuity itself. At the time, Queen Elizabeth II was in her 90s, medically classified as high risk by every standard. And this is where the story turns. March 2020. The royal household withdrew from London. Windsor Castle was selected as the operational center. Not for ceremony, but for structure. Windsor is a true fortress. Isolated, heavily walled, layered with controlled spaces, and capable of absolute regulation of entry and exit. Here, an extraordinary operational system was created. Inside the household, it became known by a semi-official name, HMS Bubble. Not a warship, but run like one, sealed at sea in a pandemic. Approximately 22 staff members were selected. Chefs, housekeepers, cleaners, engineers, security personnel. All underwent strict testing, pre-entry isolation, and then remained inside Windsor for weeks at a time, completely cut off from the outside world. No going home, no family visits, no exceptions. Inside the castle, everything changed. Secondary corridors became primary routes. Servant staircases, long unused, were reactivated. Kitchens operated on closed-loop schedules. Food was prepared, transported, and served without cross-contact. Rooms once used for state banquets and diplomatic receptions stood entirely empty. No ceremony, no crowds, no public presence. The palace entered a new state, not a military fortress, but a fortress of procedure. Every movement regulated, every interaction limited, every error capable of collapsing the system. Within that environment, the Queen continued her constitutional duties. Audiences were replaced by phone calls, speeches recorded in private rooms. No applause, no spectators, only a voice and stability. But the most important story was not what appeared on screen. It was the structure behind it. For the first time in modern history, the monarchy was protected not by symbolic authority, but by pure operational discipline. No wall can stop a virus. No crown grants immunity, only correct systems and absolute compliance. And here the escalation becomes clear. After the pandemic, the royal household was forced to reassess its entire residential model. Vast palaces, open ceremonial spaces, architectures designed for the 19th century, all suddenly became liabilities in the 21st. And as the world slowly reopened, a quiet question emerged inside those ancient walls. Are these homes still capable of surviving the future? But this is where the story turns. Because there was one house, one estate, that had already stood on the edge of disappearance long before the pandemic, and it is that story that will bring Sandringham's journey to its final chapter. Sandringham and the moment it nearly vanished in the name of modernization. After the pandemic, when vast palaces were forced to operate as sealed systems, a quiet but unavoidable question emerged inside the royal household. Are these homes still fit to exist in a new century? And that question was not new. It had appeared before, in the middle of the 20th century, when Britain stepped out of war, when the old empire contracted, when maintenance costs rose faster than usefulness, and when the monarchy was forced to learn how to live in a modern world. The story returns to Sandringham, not Buckingham, not Windsor, but a private estate, a house tied more to family life than to national ceremony. And precisely because of that, Sandringham was easier to place on the scale. By the 1950s and 1960s, the pressure became increasingly clear. An aging heating system, a structure layered with additions from different eras. Plumbing, wiring, and living spaces no longer aligned with post-war standards. Each repair exposed yet another layer of difficult history. And in that context, one proposal was quietly discussed within the household. Not announced, not formal, but serious enough to be considered. That proposal was closely associated with one man, Prince Philip. Philip was not king, but he was the husband of Queen Elizabeth II, a man of the 20th century, naval-trained, formed by war, displacement, and reconstruction. Philip believed in function, in light, in clarity of structure and efficiency. To him, Sandringham was a house stretched too far by history, overlapping wings, winding corridors, living spaces fragmented by decisions made across generations. One option was placed on the table: keep the land, but remove the entire existing structure. Build a new residence, more modern, fewer rooms, brighter, aligned with contemporary life, not to erase the past, but to move forward. And this is where the tension appeared. Because for Elizabeth II, Sandringham was not a technical problem. It was memory. It was tied to her father, King George VI, who had led Britain through war and died not long before she ascended the throne. It was the site of family Christmases. Rare moments when the monarchy was not a symbol, but simply a family. The relationship between Elizabeth and Philip stood precisely at the intersection of those two worlds, one driven by modernization, efficiency, and operation, the other by memory, continuity, and personal meaning. In the end, the plan to remove Sandringham was not carried out. There was no announcement, no declaration, only a quiet decision. Sandringham remained, repaired in sections, upgraded layer by layer, its historical asymmetries accepted rather than erased. And here something became clear. Royal homes are not static structures. They are living systems. They adapt, they conceal, they reveal cracks. And then they change again. Sandringham once stood on the edge of disappearance. Not because of war, not because of fire, not because of intrusion, but because of a very modern question. Whether memory still has a place in a world that constantly demands efficiency. And that question, like the houses themselves, continues to exist without a final answer. Throughout this story, from Sandringham to Whitehall, from water pipes hidden beneath the floors to unguarded corridors in the dead of night, power reveals itself in an unexpected form. It does not live only in thrones, not only in crowns, and not only in stone walls several meters thick. Sometimes what we call power is simply a chain of pipes that cannot be allowed to fail, a system of operations that cannot afford negligence, a discipline that cannot loosen its grip. Royal palaces have survived into the present not because they remained unchanged, but because they learned how to do two things at once. They learned how to keep secrets, and they learned how to shed their skin. They hide what must be hidden. They repair what must be repaired, and when necessary, they accept change so they do not disappear. Yet within those cracks, one question has never gone away. If a place could protect Leonardo's drawings from light for centuries, but could not protect the Queen's bedroom from an unarmed stranger, then what is truly the final wall of power? Stone, money, technology, or the people standing behind the system? And perhaps that is why stories about palaces are never really about architecture. If you want to go deeper into the hidden mechanics of power, into places that appear untouchable, yet prove far more fragile than we imagine, continue with the videos now appearing on your screen. They go further, and the contradictions grow sharper. For now, if this story gave you something to think about, leave a like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.